So the idea behind today is when we were brainstorming ideas for the lunch and learns for this year is especially to start the year, some decisions that matter regardless of the market. So in every market, kind of the thought process being that if we don't get these things right, regardless of what the market does, whether it's up, down, sideways, interest rates are going up, interest rates are going down. If we don't get these things right, it can create major problems. So the thought process of, some of these are really low-hanging fruit, and we want to make sure that we get those right, off the bat. So we're going to go back and forth. We've each got a couple topics that we wanted to talk about. Feel free to stop us and ask questions at any point. So we're going to kick things off with account titling and beneficiaries. So the thought process of if we don't get the foundation of the account properly set up, what sort of problems could we run into? And so account titling purely means, who owns those assets. But it's not as simple as that sometimes, because we've got a lot of instances where legal names change. So it's not uncommon, obviously, for in marriage, you've got an account that's in a maiden name, and now all of a sudden it needs to get into the new married name or a hyphenated name or whatever the case may be there. It's also very common that you do all this estate work with Robert, and you've gone through and you've decided that I want to put all my assets in a trust. Well, just because Robert created the trust and everybody signed off on the documents, if we don't actually change the name of the account to being the John Smith, Life Trust or whatever it would happen to be, it no longer, necessarily matters exactly what happens. And so account titling, another place that we run into differences is not only in married names, but sometimes it's really important to get one and the same letters. And so that's kind of common. We've run into this one a number of times over the years, in that someone's middle initial is the only thing that changes. And they're like, nothing changed on my account. Why do I need to do anything about it? All these things create little hiccups and delays in getting money. And so it would not be uncommon for Kathy R. Smith and Kathy A. Smith, to come up, and it creates an issue when distributions need to happen. The other thing that we find very often is how you set up your beneficiaries. And these should be reviewed on a pretty consistent basis, at least annually or every couple of years, or especially if things in life change. And beneficiary designations cause all sorts of problems. So as you can imagine, someone is married and they have their spouse listed as their beneficiary and then their kids as a contingent beneficiary. And then life happens, a divorce happens, and they don't update the beneficiary. The law will take care of that eventually. But in the meantime, you can have an ex-spouse who has a claim against your IRA until you produce the divorce decree and everybody gets involved. And, it's not uncommon to hear that, well, he was going to leave it to me anyway, and then you end up in court. And so that can happen. We've had instances where someone will say, well, I want to provide for my spouse, but I want it to go to, and this would be very often in a case of a remarriage, I want to provide for that second spouse, but I want it to ultimately go to my kids. Well, that doesn't necessarily happen if you name your new spouse as a beneficiary and your kids as contingent beneficiaries, because once you passed away, they can change it to whoever they want. And so if the intent is to get it to the kids, it might make more sense to leave that through a trust or some other means that provides for that spouse and then ultimately goes to the kids. One thing that we're running into right now, and this is something that we're starting to talk to a lot of people about, is it used to be a common practice, and we're in the process of updating this for a lot of people, to name your estate as the beneficiary of your IRA. And that has started to cause a lot of problems. And so there's a lot of reasons why that can cause a problem. So if you leave it directly to a spouse, the spouse becomes their IRA, just like it was yours. If you leave it to anybody other than your spouse, there are new rules with Secure 2.0 that make things extremely difficult. So that might be, if it's a kid, well, you've got 10 years to pull it out. Well, that's fine. If it's a trust, that's fine. But if you leave it to an estate, you can have all sorts of new rules that apply. And so if you haven't started taking your RMD out, the estate actually becomes the owner of that IRA, and the money ends up with the kids. But ultimately, you have a 5-year rule instead of a 10-year rule. Another issue that can happen there is if you leave the money to the estate, it can turn into the fact that if you already are taking your RMDs, it uses the decedent's age for their RMD. So let's say you have an age disparity in spouses, and that would be similar. So let's say somebody was 75 and taking the RMDs, and they were married to somebody who was 65. Well, you're taking the money out at the age factor of a 75-year-old, so you're potentially taking it out in a much faster and more taxable situation. So there's all these little things that happen, and if we can just get it right on the front end, so if we can title the account correctly, if we can get the beneficiary set the way you want, and then as life happens, adjust those things, that can eliminate so many problems.
So we get the account set up first, and then we start figuring out what the location of the different assets will be. So asset location is a structural decision that affects taxes and long-term compounding over time, no matter what direction the market is going. Asset allocation decides what you own. So that's stocks, bonds, gold, alternatives. But asset location is where we hold those investments account-wise. And there's typically 3 different types of accounts that we would put these in, or 3 different locations. There's the tax-deferred accounts. That's your IRAs. That's your 401ks. There are tax-free accounts, which are your Roths. And then there's your taxable brokerage accounts, which will be taxed differently for everybody. The goal is to place each asset where the tax characteristics of the location maximize how efficient that asset could be in that account. And this matters because taxes are one of the few variables that we as investors have partial control over. 2 portfolios with the identical investments, with identical returns, can end up with 2 very different after-tax results simply because the assets were placed in different accounts. And over time and over decades, that really starts to compound. So let's take a step back and review those 3 different types of accounts really quick. The tax-deferred accounts, again, that's your traditional IRAs and that's your 401ks. These allow investments to grow without current taxation. But the withdrawals from those accounts are taxable to you as if they're ordinary income. Tax-free accounts, that's your Roth IRAs, those allow investments to grow and be withdrawn without paying taxes on it. Because of that, a lot of investors really like to put their big, potential high growth stocks in their Roth IRAs because they're not going to have to pay taxes on that again, as long as they follow all of the rules. Taxable brokerage accounts receive a different type of tax treatment. Long-term capital gains, which are just securities that you hold for longer than 1 year, and qualified dividends are taxed at a lower rate than ordinary income, and investors can benefit from holding positions for longer. They can also take advantage if they lose money in a position. They can tax loss harvest and cancel out some of their other gains. And when they pass away, there's a step up in basis for the new owner, so they're not held to the same cost basis restraints that the original owner was. So if we were to bring this back to what we're talking about today and how it matters in every market, asset location does not depend on the being able to predict the markets or interest rates or whether markets rise or fall. taxation is going to remain relevant. So the takeaway here is many investors will accumulate accounts over time through 401ks from other jobs, IRAs and Roth IRAs that they started, brokerage accounts, and so forth. And without coordinating how the investments are placed inside of them, they can lose quite a bit of efficiency. Periodically reviewing your asset location is going to improve your tax efficiency, and it's going to affect your overall return. And it's one of the more subtle decisions that Peter and you all have to make when we're looking at these accounts. Where do I want to hold NVIDIA? If I would have bought NVIDIA for, we'll say $5,000 a few years ago in a taxable account, we're having a total different conversation than if you bought that in your Roth.
We talked about getting things correct from a titling standpoint and from where do we hold these. And then managing risk is something that, yes, it matters in every market. It especially matters in bad markets. And so markets are always going to fluctuate. And typically, even safe asset markets fluctuate. And so for me, what managing risk is really more about is knowing going into any type of market, what is our scenarios? How much downside risk do I have? Where can I leverage, safety in certain places? And then also where can I leverage my ability to take risk? And so misaligned risk, the biggest, I guess, issue that comes with that is the emotional decisions that happen because of it. So typically it's not that uncommon that everything's going well. We've had actually 3 years here of, if you go back over 25, 24, 23, we've had double-digit returns in the stock market. Well, that can hide a lot of, inability to take risk because everything's going up. And the thought process being that, yes, even though something's going up, we always have to be prepared for us to go to war with Iran, apparently, and have the market sell off, 6-7% from the highs that it got into. Even though we're only down a couple percent from the start of the year, we've given up almost 7% from the highs. And so it enables you to ride through fluctuations like that in a way that is planned on the front end, because we know it's going to happen. We don't know when the market's going to sell off, but we know pretty consistently that the market's going to have a 5, a 10, a 15% correction at some point. And so we have to plan for that on the front end. And so we do a lot of things. A lot of times you'll hear the word diversification thrown out there. It's not just about diversifying, because I can diversify with 5 different stocks and still be 100% allocated to the stock market. It's diversifying across asset classes. It's diversifying within asset classes. As I said, you can be in a risky scenario in a 100% safe asset. So if I own CDs, and this is a situation that we're about to be in, right now, CD markets are roughly 3.8%, we'll call it, across different time periods, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. They're all basically 3.8%. Well, if inflation spikes again and we're up with 4% inflation, we're losing money in a safe asset. And so we've actually added risk by only being in safe things. And so it's taking all of those different factors and putting them together. And so you've got the account title, we know where the things are at. And then once we have them, where's our risk? And the other thing that I wanted to mention is your risk tolerance changes over time. And that's something that a lot of people fail to adjust in their portfolios. And it's something that we'll deal with a lot. So Brian, obviously being younger than I am, can take more risks than I am from a time horizon standpoint. But if he's 65 and still riskier, the same risk level that he is today, he's probably overexposed. So this is another one of those things, kind of like updating beneficiaries, that we have to constantly be aware of and constantly adjusting, not because the market has changed, but because our life has changed. And so that could also be, someone who's young all of a sudden has an issue where, well, I've got to get a lot more conservative because my spouse has just been diagnosed with cancer or something of that ilk. So we've always got to be aware of what's going on not only within the market, but within people's lives, so that the risk that we're taking with assets matches that. And so that's, we talk about risk a lot because to me, it's always been more important to manage the downside than maybe optimize the top. Now, that's not always the case, but it's always important to know what our downside is.
And I actually like that liquidity and cash flow follow that, because to me, liquidity and cash flow is the same conversation as risk. Because liquidity and cash flow planning determine whether investors are forced to react to the market or if they can remain disciplined through them, no matter what's happening. So before we start, let's define a few concepts. Liquidity. That refers to how quickly an asset can be converted to cash without significantly affecting its value. Cash, super liquid. Short-term CDs, pretty liquid. Long-term CDs, not so much, and sometimes stocks, not so much. Cash flow refers to the regular movement of money into and out of a household or a portfolio. And together, these determine whether you can meet your spending needs without disrupting your long-term plans. So here's why all of this matters. Markets move pretty unpredictably in the short term. Investors who lack sufficient liquidity often are forced to sell assets in a downturn of the market to cover those expenses. That can lock in losses, and it can disrupt your long-term plans. Where adequate liquidity will allow investors to maintain their strategy even when the market's in a downturn. So let's look at what this looks like in practice. And this is the way I probably had this conversation with a few of you. First, you should maintain a proper cash reserve. This is your nest egg. This is what's going to keep things together in case of an emergency. My water heater went out a little while ago. Had I not had a nest egg, the situation would have been totally different. The second thing is structure your portfolio so that spending needs can be met without disrupting the growth of the account. I like to separate everything into multiple buckets. We have long-term, short-term, mid-term buckets. The longer-term savings, that's going to be more aggressive. We've got years before we need that. That can grow. Shorter-term stuff, we might be willing to take a lower return so that we can protect the principal of it and not have a cash shortfall when an emergency runs up. So I'm sure most of you have also heard me and Peter talk about this. Give us as much notice as possible before you need money. That allows us to rearrange those buckets to where that short-term money is available for you when you need it. And that goes back to what Peter was saying. The market doesn't have to change in order for your account to have to change to match your needs. So if you have a need coming up and we don't know about it, it's hard for us to adjust the portfolio to have those short-term reserves ready for you. And third, you should plan for the predictable cash flow. Things are going to get more expensive. You're going to need more money over time. And assume things are going to fall apart before they're supposed to, because they will. There's also some behavioral benefits that come with this sort of planning. Liquidity planning reduces the emotional pressure that comes with volatility. Do you know who does not freak out when their retirement account goes down? 18 to 20-year-olds. It does not affect their liquidity whatsoever. Nothing about their current life changes. Well, as you start approaching retirement age, that starts to affect you a little bit more and more over time. Liquidity matters. Also want to connect the discussion back to the day's event theme. Liquidity and cash flow planning are decisions that matter in every market. If the market is down or up, you still need money to pay your mortgage. You still need money to buy that new car, fix the radiator, or whatever. Bull markets make liquidity unnecessary. I don't mind selling something at a gain to get you money. Bear markets really reveal the importance of having short-term, safer assets, though. And a well-structured liquidity plan allows the investment portfolio to meet your needs while still maintaining that long-term outlook and keep that plan going.
So this is where all that liquidity that Brian has made sure that we have comes into play. And so this is how the money actually comes out. And similar to the concept that we were talking about earlier, whereas if you put the money in the right locations, if you take the money out of the right locations, it can make a massive difference as well. And so when money comes out of a taxable account, there's no tax to you. You've paid your taxes along the way. When money comes out of a Roth account, there's no tax to you. You've put that money in with pre-tax, and that's why the Roth is the best way to invest over time. The money that's coming out of a traditional IRA, a 401k, a 403b, any of those type retirement accounts, that's taxed to you as ordinary income in the year that you take it. And so when we look at a situation, so somebody calls up and says, hey, I need $20,000. This has just happened. Car broke down, positive things, a kid's getting married, could be good and bad reasons why we need to withdraw money. It's our job to look at the various accounts that people have and come up with a plan that both minimizes taxes in the short term, but also is looking over that long-term horizon and saying, okay, where is this money coming from? So I'll give you a good example of why taking money out of two different IRAs can make a massive difference. Let's say we take money out of an IRA that's a Roth, that it's not taxed. Well, we've not also affected Social Security or Medicare. Now, let's say we take it out of a regular IRA and it pushes us over the limit. Now, all of a sudden, because the amount that you're paying for Medicare Part B is determined based upon your ordinary income, we might have pushed you over certain thresholds, and it can double or even triple your Medicare Part B monthly premium that's being withheld out of Social Security. And so we're constantly looking for these different places of where and why can it come out? Where are we going to experience the most growth going on? So it can be very legitimate to take the money out of a regular IRA and pay the taxes right now, as opposed to taking it out of the Roth. Because if we're expecting the Roth to grow leaps and bounds, we want to leave the money in there as long as possible. So it's important to look at it and say, where is this coming from? And that's really a lot of times our job to hear the request and provide that counsel. So if somebody calls up and says, I need X amount of money, then it's our job to look at the accounts and say, okay, well, if we take it from here, this is what happens. If we take it from here, this is what happens. I recently just did this with one of our clients who's actually also my uncle, so I'm allowed to tell the story. He called up and needed a certain dollar amount, and it needed to come out of his IRA. It was in December. And he wanted the money, but it didn't need to be immediate. So we actually came up with the plan. We took half the money in December. We took half the money in January. And that kept him underneath certain income brackets that enabled us to plan for that. And that's why what Brian said is so important earlier of the earlier we know about one of these needs, the more of that we can do. Now, if you call up and say, I need the money tomorrow, you need the money tomorrow. And we're going to be in whatever boat that we happen to be in. We're still going to try to pull it from the right place. But we might not be able to achieve the same longevity as possible. Another thing that we talk to a lot of people about is once we hit certain ages, we have required minimum distributions from our IRAs. Well, that amount has to come out, but our withdrawal strategy can also come into play with charitable contributions in that case. And so you might call up early in the year and say, hey, I have X pledge to my church and I need to give them money. So can I get, $5,000 out of my account? Well, if I know that you have a required minimum distribution of $6,000, then I'm going to recommend you take that out of your IRA as opposed to taking it out of your taxable account. But if you just call up and say, hey, I need $5,000, can you send it to me out of my regular account? Without knowing the context that was going to a charity, of course you can have $5,000. It's your money, type thing. So planning for that and where money comes out can really extend the life of a portfolio. And so kind of those were the big ticket items that we wanted to talk about. And I think kind of sequentially they go from step to step to step. But they're all things that matter regardless of what the stock market does. Like I said to begin with, if the market's up 20 or down 20, none of those things that we just talked about really are effective one way or the other. And if we can get those right, it can make a dramatic difference. And I think one of the biggest ones really is asset location. If I had to pick one of those things out of the 5, asset location to me is the one that's going to drive returns the most. The other are going to drive taxes and headaches. But returns are going to, because as you said, if you put that money in NVIDIA in a Roth, congratulations. But if it was in just a regular taxable account, you can be stuck in a situation where it makes it hard to sell and take a 15% capital gains tax or an 18.8 or a 20 or 23.8, depending upon where you're at. So asset location to me is what we deal with probably the most. But the other, if we can get them right on the front end, makes a huge difference.